The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Lenin Moreno Garcés, Constitutional President of Ecuador. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Lenin Moreno Garcés, Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador, and to invite him to address the Assembly. Mr. President.
Está muy abajo. Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, colleagues, friends, and truly you are friends. There are principles governing coexistence between human beings that are recognized as universal principles. They are valid both in times of peace and in times of conflict, and they govern coexistence between states as well, and I'd like to mention a couple of examples. Do unto other nations as you would have other nations do unto you. Never tolerate abuse against anyone, nor should you ever not help those who are needy to the extent of your possibility. Violence only begets violence, and the results are passed on from one generation to the next. Peace between countries is born of tolerance, and it is born of cultivating common interests. And so the question arises, without any conflict between states that has ever been eternal, why not build peace as soon as possible? These and other visions of coexistence between persons applied to the life between states and societies are reflected, in other words, in the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. These are the columns that support this broad space which provides us with shelter. The General Assembly of the United Nations. The United Nations multilateral action exists because these principles are useful for us, because they are the guideline to coexisting in peace and harmony, because they empower the specific interests of states and guide the interaction of states with each other. This organization is a living example of multilateralism, which continues to be an instrument that's entirely necessary. That is the image of cooperation which can be consolidated through borders and regions. Peaceful resolution of disputes is always on the table. It's an example and a reflection of that, and it's an alternative of the horrors of violence. Human beings, we need to work together on our problems, the problems of our time: sustainable development, climate change, protection and conservation of nature, construction of societies that do not discriminate, but rather include everyone, dialogue between cultures and thoughts which are different. It is to shelter these principles that are enshrined in the Charter of San Francisco that we can work towards a better world, seeking to promote different facets, country by country, region by region, tackling conflict by conflict. When international cooperation is null and void, or when wars continue, when injustices seem to last an eternity, then usually it's because states have not found a path or do not have the political will to apply these principles, the principles of the United Nations. Today, more than ever, multilateralism and the system of the United Nations is under considerable attack with harmful effects. We are witnessing sustained attempts to weaken the international multilateral system and to weaken the work of the United Nations and undermine it. And that's why we call for standing and upholding these principles. Climate change, sustainable development, humanitarian crises, which are much too protracted, large-scale human rights abuses, widespread poverty, growing inequality, threats to peace and international security. These are just a few of the issues. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, dialogue is the very basis of multilateral action, and it nourishes the United Nations, and we should continue to allow it to nourish this organization. What moves it is the relationship between states, the spirit of analysis, working together to look at problems, respecting different points of view, and especially based on building consensus and agreement. Without dialogue, we cannot understand each other. Without a spirit of democracy and democratic practice, we cannot understand each other. With unilateral imposition, we cannot understand each other. And this is true not just for people, but also for national societies. In Ecuador, we are driving forward an initiative so that we can find an agreement, so that all members of society can find points of view that will join us together, solutions to that where we thought differently before. It's enough now with concentrating on what separates us and what differentiates us. It's enough. We need to look at what unites us, what we identify with, what will enable us to cultivate greater common well-being. The quest for a national agreement amongst all the various actors in our society is not easy. Agreement arises precisely from overcoming together the difficulties, from finding points where there are a coincidence and where we can agree, to leave the door open for agreement and innovation in the quest for solution. Without agreement, where is the alternative? What is the alternative? A national agreement is the best antidote to intolerance and in unilateral action. It's the best antidote to a lack of respect for human rights and in favor of building democratic societies in facts, not just in forms and proclamations. Ladies and gentlemen, on the international level, national agreement has another name, but it's the same spirit behind it, and we call it multilateral action. The multilateral focus proposed and promoted by the United Nations is the best tool available for common action of all societies to build a better world that we all dream of. To tackle those problems, be they domestic, we're all affected by them equally, be they poverty eradication, quality education, protecting the planet, or inclusion. We live together in the same place, the planet Earth. The size of the Earth and the resources are limited in size and scope. And given the population that is growing without stopping, there are challenges to the environment, inequalities in wealth, emergencies which impact our ability to provide well-being and respect human rights. This is a world where there is still the temptation of imposing a specific vision or specific interests through the use of force. The only tool and the only way out is through concerted action of all states. It's by working together on global comprehensive solutions, and thus we must work together towards solving global problems. Climate change, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, pollution of the oceans, undermining human rights, limiting world trade, and the marginal importance of fair trade are all issues which cannot be adequately resolved if we don't work together, without political will, without the contribution of all countries. Disarmament, especially nuclear disarmament, and the future ban on weapons of mass destruction is a goal. It's a goal for coexistence and a goal that's especially valid in regions where conflicts are underway or are latent. If we pay attention to the conflicts or the conflict areas today, we will see that they all have one constant common denominator, and that is the risk of the use of weapons of mass destruction. That's why Ecuador deposited its ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, not because our country could have them, of course, but mostly because uncontrolled possession of this weapon could be misused, deliberately or by accident, and could lead to brutal consequences, not just limited to those involved in the war, an atomic war, but it would impact the entire world, the whole planet. We would all be victims of radioactive contamination for centuries. We and our descendants would be subject to poisonous agents, which would lead to disastrous diseases and genetic deformations. Global problems, friends, affect us all and hurt us all. If some of us do not impact us immediately, they will because we belong to the human race. We must have empathy with the victims, and we must think in those who suffer. We must think about those societies that are grappling with these issues directly. Terencio said it well, and his wisdom continues. Nothing that is human is foreign to me. Dialogue, multilateral action, national agreement within Ecuador are not hanging in the air unsupported. There's a context which defines the action of nations, of social actors, which, if we speak in sports terms, sets out the pitch for the game. Here I'm talking about fundamental rights of people, which are reflected in the Constitution of Ecuador. They're enshrined in the Universal Charter, in international treaties which protect the political, economic, social, and cultural guarantees included in the human rights and the relationship with nature. Ecuador has become the 5th country in the world to ratify the 18 United Nations Conventions on the Protection of Human Rights. If there is anything to which I aspire as a legacy for my country, it would be the deep-seated conviction, the work to protect, promote, respect, and enjoy human rights and fundamental freedoms. Recovering democratic institutions in Ecuador, respecting free expression of people and the media, guarantee of action of political opponents and citizen organizations, elimination of bureaucratic entities, all to and bureaucracies, eliminating bureaucracies created to expand the power of the state at the expense of civil society. These are our goals. All of this are in line with the work of my government, which has been working in coordination with Agenda 2030, especially on Objectives 5, 4, and 16 relating to inclusive education, equitable and quality education, equality of gender, empowerment of all women and girls, and the promotion of fair societies which are peaceful and inclusive. Of course, this is not a simple task. A great deal of work has gone in to creating a culture of fear, of breaking institutions, legal institutions, of playing on public opinion and on freedom of expression. But with decision, being constant in our efforts, we will be able to dismantle the state of propaganda. We will be able to eliminate institutions that try to silence the press. We will eliminate an intelligence service which, rather than protecting the interests of the collective, was dedicated to recording private conversations of Ecuadorian men and women and looking at the lives of political opposition and hacking their electronic communications and databases. We have been successful thus far in this task, and of that I am very proud. It's a healthy pride to have left clean air for democracy to breathe, and closing off intolerance, abuse, and the quest of vanity, power, and power for power. The special rapporteurs coming to Ecuador who were looking at the issue of freedom of expression from both the OAS and the United Nations looked at the impact on the indigenous people and their physical and mental health. Ecuador has now become once again a participant in human rights fora of the Inter-American system, and we have subscribed to the optional protocol of the Third Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is not just one more signature. It is along the lines of our decisive action which led us to be the first country in our region to subscribe to the convention that protects one of the sectors that's most vulnerable in our societies, childhood. Another vulnerable sector are the migrants. We have welcomed some 500,000 Venezuelan brothers and sisters, victims of the worst exodus of our continent. It is the job of the United Nations to find a definitive solution for Venezuela. Our brothers and sisters in Venezuela say they have no food, no medicine, no health care, that education has been cast aside. They leave their land because they're desperate. And no one should abandon their beloved land, their beloved family. Nobody abandons their friends out of pride or self-love. They do so because they have to. It's a diaspora created by a despotic government lacking any humanism. In Ecuador, despite our insufficiencies of resources, we have attended to all those who reached our land up until the month of August. Today, in this World Democratic Forum, we call upon everyone to have a dialogue with the victims of this conflict, to help them to find a way out of the disaster created by an irresponsible government, de facto irresponsible. And for our part, Ecuador will host in November a session of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We will also be hosting the World Forum on Migration and Development that my country has been presiding over. In the area of economic human rights, social and cultural rights, as I was saying, Ecuador continues to be progressive and is multiplying its efforts in this way. Our development plan, Development for Whole Life, and our mission called the Manuals effectively implement our strategies, efforts undertaken to maximize and go beyond habitual limitations of budget. Comprehensive programs which protect all human beings from conception until the time that the Creator calls us back. Civil and political rights need to be implemented without delay, but more economic, social, and cultural rights recognized in international treaties and enshrined in them are also progressive in their implementation. But there's a special significance of these rights for developing countries. The fact that they are current and the work to promote them is crucial for most of the world. They call upon universal values. Ladies and gentlemen, protecting the planet, our huge house, is something that we cannot postpone. In Ecuador, we already have a law on energy efficiency. We have a pact for the circular economy for the productive sector and a new economy in plastics. We have proceeded to the elimination subsidies of imports of electric cars and established credits, preferential credits for sustainable mobility with renewable energies for public transportation. We're working on progress and development. It's a concept based on evolution, and some have thought it was consuming and selfish. We need to move away from that model and away from the negative tendencies which impact humans' ability to coexist. These tendencies which persist, we need to move towards solidarity, sisterhood and brotherhood, and mutual respect. The international community needs to systematically increase action that cultivates solidarity, that preserve brotherly and sisterly ties, and respect not just the environment, but also different cultures. Cultures of countries on the other side of the sea, victims of conflict caused by hunger or natural disasters, which are increasingly aggressive due to the pernicious effects of global warming. The only way for cooperation and solidarity between nations to mold international life is by practicing them. That would be simple. Continuing and persisting with specific concrete efforts, which stress that which unites us and not that which makes us different. Friends, economic, social, and cultural rights should become pillars of our management as authorities. My dream is, we should dream, that someday we would measure development by the number of people with disabilities who have been included fully. We would measure evolution by the absence of gender-based violence, and progress would be measured by the number of values and principles are seen in the classes, in the press, at the ballot boxes. It depends on us. It depends on our conviction for us to be able to put ethics of our civilization, and not as some sort of utopic, unreachable goals, but rather as aspirations that we must reach, that we can start with, as a way to act. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of Ecuador for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet Mr. President, and the restroom is prepared for the next speaker.